am so pleased that Dan is finally here. I have been bugging him for, I think it's a year and a half to come up here. So I'm really, really glad that he's here tonight. And I saw him speak about 3 years ago over on Orcas Island and was so incredibly impressed. I thought I have to bring him up again and share with him all of his wonderful knowledge with all of us on this island. So thank you, Dan, for being here.
Thank you.
Dan is the founding director of the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory at UC Berkeley. He is also a professor of energy at UC Berkeley, and he travels the world. He works with the International Panel on Climate Change as a lead author on many of their reports. He even contributed to the Pope's encyclical. So we have a celebrity in our midst, and I'm really glad he's here, and I'm going to let him take over and share lots of wonderful ideas. I think you'll be astounded.
Linda, thank you so much for doing this. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here, but in particular Linda and everyone who has done so much to both get the word out on projects, to make it such a pleasant trip. And my wife and daughter came along on this one, and so this is really a pleasure. So Dylan and Lara, can you just say thank you before I start up? Really appreciate it. And truth be told, I tried to believe in and demonstrate equity when I got to come before my older daughter came. And the way that we have saved most energy in our house is to get rid of her and have her go to college. Because shower bills have gone way down. It's been just a fabulous improvement on our carbon footprint. Now we gave her to university. It's a problem to deal with. But I just want to thank you all for being here and to really encourage you. We'll have a time for a discussion at the end. But if there's a particular point that you want to ask a question on, clarify, just jump in. I'm probably too blind to call, but just to raise your hand, make a noise, because it doesn't make sense to wait till the end. If it's something which is really pressing, just jump in. If it's really a big debate topic, I'll pretend to know and then not answer it afterwards. But if it's anything that kind of just contributes to the conversation, please just kind of jump in as we go. I arrived here last night. I've arrived in Seattle last night from a really interesting week in Washington, D.C., where for the first time we did 2 White House events on Monday and yesterday. Monday was on all of the interesting things that the U.S. government is doing to get us ready for the big climate conference, the COP, the Conference of the Parties, taking place in Paris in December, where it looks like, and I'll come back to this in a bit, we have already achieved success without getting there, as opposed to 19 previous conferences where we made a lot of meetings, a lot of people flew a long way, and left with basically nothing. And so there's a real interesting change, and I'll try to come to that. But then yesterday, the White House did another event on off-grid energy for poor people, not just developing countries, but people who are underserved. And I really want to try to highlight not just all of the challenges and the issues that we can talk about that directly affect communities in the U.S., communities like this and where I live in Oakland, which are in general quite progressive on energy issues, but the much broader conversation about energy issues and its impact on poor people around the world. And so I want to try tonight to go back and forth and to really highlight technologies, science, policy, and behavior issues that are common and different as you look around the world very broadly. And I'll come back to the reasons why for that in a second. But the basic version is pretty simple, and that is that even if we have great success here in the San Juans in California, we're still talking about a tiny percentage of global energy consumption. And unless the really interesting and challenging stories going on in communities like this spread, you can't win by winning just at home. It has to be a global story to really make the climate change, to make climate change not happen, which sounds a bit backwards, but to make this kind of a winning story. And so one of the things that my laboratory does is to engage in a kind of variety of policy levels. And just to give an example of the degree to which things are really changing, Secretary of State Clinton formed a panel called ECPA, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, where all of the ministers of energy, environment from all of the Western Hemisphere would gather each year and find some real clear ways to learn from each other and to share best practices. And so an example is kind of doing a press conference in Managua about energy issues and then traveling to some field sites on the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua to look at some projects which are providing energy to local communities. And some of the innovations going on in places like this are well ahead of what we're doing here. And so I just want to highlight, this is not kind of a, you solve it first in North America and Europe and then kind of things trickle down. Many of the really key issues I'll try to get into, the innovations are happening rapidly at a global level. So I want to get to that good part of the story, but first I want to just summarize the bad news because it is bad news, and many of you give talks and have community conversations, and there's a couple sort of tools that I just think are useful to have in front of you. And so the standard way that the climate science community tells its story is wonderfully accurate scientifically, but has been a monumental snooze and a bore in terms of the broader news and things until a couple events like certain hurricanes and storms have gone on. And so the story that we tell over and over again is that if we look at the temperature record going back about a century, that we've had this slow and steady warming until about the 1950s, then it's been steadily increasing, and the path that until just a few years ago we were on was by the end of this century to have a temperature rise of 4 or more degrees. And every scientific study done in the US, Europe, China, Asia, Africa highlights the incredible damage that that would do if we get that level of warming. Just one example is that if we hit sort of 3 to 3.5 degrees, we are guaranteed to irreversibly melt Greenland. And while Greenland is just one island, it's basically a big cavity. It's a big tooth full of ice. Greenland melts, and we get 20 plus feet of sea level rise from one island. I think I said such a bad thing that someone muted me. So maybe I'll just, as long as it's loud enough, I'll just do it like this until it... thanks so much. And so, you know, energy issues and storage and stuff we have to worry about here. Oh, did you? Oh, you got it back on. All right. So 20 feet by melting Greenland, and we're pretty certain that about here that happens irreversibly. It may already be irreversible or close to it. But just to give you a feeling, and if we melt Antarctica, that's another 65 feet. And so we don't even want to get into that. But just this red threshold really hits this kind of issue. And so the international community has been advocating, I would argue, importantly but relatively ineffectively, that 2 degrees C should really be our threshold because the costs of going beyond that are really unfathomable. And up until very recently, the idea we would get off of this red path and limit our warming to about 1.5 degrees would be nice, or 2 degrees. That seemed like kind of scientific science fiction in the sense that we know we should do it, but the chances of getting there were very low. And the damages of being over that are not just confined to things like melting Greenland. There's a whole issues of disruption, extreme weather events. It's just a very ugly story. Being below 2 degrees, or 1.5 as I've drawn here, doesn't guarantee we're not going to be dealing with problems. In fact, I don't see too many youth here. I think there might be the football game. But you know, my daughter who is 12 here, she's going to inherit a mess no matter how well we solve it. And so we want to make the mess smaller, but we have already passed on to that generation just a huge disaster to deal with. But every little bit of rise above this makes the problem worse. And somewhere up here, there are disasters that we cannot even fathom, such as turning off entirely the circulation in the ocean. We don't know at what temperature rise that will happen, There are estimates in this range, but if you turn off the conveyor belt of heat that runs in our oceans now, Europe basically freezes over. There are things that are kind of unfathomably disastrous. And so we want to limit the scale of those things. And at the same time, of course, energy demands are rising around the world. Everyone watches what's going on in China. But right now, the fastest growing economic region of the world is East Africa. And energy is playing an interesting critical role in that. But if we're going to provide energy services to people around the planet, we essentially need to take a picture now where there is an abundance of energy in North America, Europe, parts of East Asia, and there are huge parts of the world that are just unpowered by energy. And so while climate change is part of the central driver, we need to recognize that 1.5 billion people have no access to electricity today. And the forecast is they will continue to have no access in 2030. And in particular in South and Southeast Asia, the number of people whose lifestyles are ramping up incredibly rapidly, so that the footprint of human activity is going to be just overwhelming if we can't find ways not to reduce quality of life, but to find a way to really make that a clean, much more sustainable process. So, the reason why many of you are here is because climate, I don't need to sort of detail the climate change story, but everyone runs into a climate denier probably more often than we think. And so I wanted to highlight kind of a graphic, kind of a result that's worthwhile having in your back pocket. And so I'll show you a 22-second movie. It's downloadable from the nasa.gov site. And there's no modeling, no analysis. This is simply satellite images taken over the North Pole each year and strung together as a movie. And specifically, these movies are put together for the time in late summer, early fall, generally the second half of August, the first week of September, when the sea ice is at its minimum. And it's just a straight observational feature. Again, no modeling, no Senator Imhoff conspiracy of the left or whatever else it might be. But it just highlights how dramatic the change that we've already seen is. And so this will just run that movie. Oh, it doesn't want to run because it doesn't like the projector here. So I'm going to do, this is a typical problem. Let me just do, I'll pull it up from the source. So we'll just run it from the original. So sorry about that little delay. So here is this zoom in. This is million square kilometers of sea ice going back to the 70s. And of course, there are colder and hotter years, so that the sea ice extent is different. And so you see there are some years where it got really warm. We had a very minimal amount of sea ice. Some years where it bounced back. And it gives you kind of a feeling for the noise in the system. But we're going back now for 30 years. And what you see overall is that we've gone from an average of around 6.5 million square kilometers of ice over the pole down to half of that in recent time. 30-year record, 35-year record now, very, very well observed. The satellites have been there doing very steady observations. Again, no modeling, no analysis involved. And those of you who have seen movies like Chasing Ice know that it's not just the extent, but that the thickness goes down too. So we're losing a huge amount as a result of this process. And again, if one needed a 20-second kind of analysis-free image, this is the kind of thing that I think is just worthwhile to have if you wanted to sort of convince someone who is skeptical about something that the science community is no longer skeptical about at all. That's the grim news for where we are now and what the problems are. But on the other hand, we have seen this series of remarkable events. Things like the Pope adding this incredibly eloquent voice, not just around what the science is, but how it ties to our economy more broadly. His choice of traveling from the airport when he was in DC in a relatively humble, not a Pope-mobile, a people-mobile, was an example. And I just mentioned the events of the White House. It's a really interesting time, and it's a time where the community working on this is more hopeful than any point before. And it's not because the basic science of the technologies has changed at all. Just to put in mind something we've known for a long time, This small purple circle here is total global energy use today. The units are terawatts of power. There's no quiz on the units later on. It's 10 to the 12 watts. The estimate is that by 2050, we'll about triple that. And so in terms of the amount of energy, the total reserve of coal, of uranium, now it's those that will use up natural gas, petroleum, and coal are one thing. Others that we can breed more of if you want to use breeder reactors, the amount of geothermal and hydro, and the amount of solar power. So it kind of gives you a feel that the amount of the resource is not the issue. We're not going to have 50 years of most of these, although the recent discoveries of gas and frack gas have expanded that dramatically. But renewables have plenty of resources, and if you count renewables and uranium if you're pro-nuclear, there's a whole range of options. So it's never been a story of the technology. We critically need to make the technologies cheaper, more reliable, but the real challenge we've come to is much broader than that. And it's an area where, quite frankly, the science community that I'm part of has proven itself to be pretty ill-equipped to tell a broader story about the ethics, and that's where people like the Pope have played a huge role, where community decisions, where understanding the downsides of making poor choices around the climate are so critical. So from there, let me kind of highlight some of the good side of what's going on. So what I showed you before was this path to, say, 4.5 degrees of climate change, and that's this really disastrous story. As of last week, the global commitments made by the 145 of the 189 nations that have so far submitted their plans have remarkably dropped about a degree or a little more off that target. Remember, our overall is a 2 degree or less warming. But this shows that without doing some of the things we'll describe in the next half an hour or so, some really interesting mixtures of technology and policy, we are making progress. And this is not a trivial shave off this amount. It shows a huge range, a need to go further, but a pretty interesting start. And this is something that I think 10 years ago no one would have predicted we would have gotten at least this level of progress. And so I would argue that this meeting in Paris is already a success. We're already going to be able to say that we do not have everything we need. We have maybe a little less than half of the cuts required, but it is a accelerating process. It is a remarkable transformation. And the kind of things that have played a really critical role are stories like this. And so this is the price history of solar, but I've flipped it around a bit. This is plotted in physics and engineering language. Time does not run along the axis here. Time is just a date stamp along this curve, and what's plotted in logarithmic units is the price going from $5 a watt down to where we are now. And what's along here is the total global production of solar cells. And I'm plotting it this way because, first of all, if you do it this way, log space, the slope of this line tells you how quickly the technology is improving. The slope of that line is about 20%. What it says is that every time we double the number of units sold, price drops by 20%. And each of these really critical individual innovations are things that happened along the way. We got better saws that cut the silicon much more without losing much material. We found a way to cast it in large amounts. Lots of individual things, getting rid of tin, all kinds of things in solar cells that improve them, so that now solar is cost competitive. And that's something that people really did not think would happen at this point, even 10 years ago. But what this curve really highlights is a whole series of innovations, some of which came by basic research, but a huge amount came from actual deployment in the field. And so the kind of things that people who installed solar on the rooftops, invested in companies, things have done, have changed the landscape. And so let me start off with an island, a different island than this one. This is actually an island deeded to the Brando family in French Polynesia. But I want to highlight this because it tells a version of the story that says science and technology is critical, but But really, what we need to do is find ways to deploy. And so when we were asked to do this project in French Polynesia, how could I say no, right? It's not a bad place to go do field work. My students were clamoring. They bribed me by saying I could bring my family. And this was the island that was given to Marlon Brando for making Mutiny on the Bounty. And so kind of a neat spot. His son lived in a very sort of bizarre thatched hut on the edge of the island, but they decided they wanted to create a sustainable research and eco-community there. And so around the airstrip on the island, they said, what can we put together here as a system that would allow us to build a zero carbon setting? And so what they worked through, and over 24 months designed and built, was a series of bungalows and a research center to study the motu, to study the reef system. And what they put together is kind of a wonderful first example of what one might do. So on this island, the first thing they did was to install a solar array. And they looked at various designs. They actually ultimately put a solar array which runs along next to the runway. There is part of it which is raised up, but part of it is a solar strip, which is actually the plane, it's the taxiway. And so they're double using that space because space is constrained in the island. So they put a half a megawatt solar array in place. And then they collected coconut to make biofuel out of. And they discovered in the process of collecting coconut on the island that other islands in French Polynesia were selling at a loss coconut to Hawaii because of an existing contract that had been signed by the French government with Hawaii 30 years before. So they changed the agreement, and they now harvest coconut from neighboring islands. They make additional biofuel, and they now sell it to neighboring islands as a fuel. They installed a large pipe that runs a kilometer out, and because the water is very cold, they access the 5.5 degree seawater from the deep ocean. That's 900 meters deep. They bring it up, and their air conditioning bill, and it's very hot and humid there, has been cut by 95% by just cycling cold water up to the island. They wanted to have a very reliable system, so they installed, at that point, a fairly expensive and experimental technology, a liquid battery called a flow battery that does not degrade, whereas most batteries have a few hundred to a couple thousand cycles. This has 1 million cycles before it degrades at all. Clearly I'll try that. We'll try that again. There we go. So they have this flow battery that gives them 3 days of backup for their island. And then the last thing they did was to install a wave energy generator. It's a tank of fresh water moored to the ocean floor, goes back and forth, and this provides energy, but it also provides fresh water. And so they now have a system where they use part of the cycle to run a reverse osmosis system. And it highlights something which I think is really critical here, and that is each of these technologies 10 years ago were not cost effective. This is a resort. They put this whole project in place. They did it as a commercial project, up and running 24 months after the beginning of construction. The whole thing is up in operation. And it really highlights the degree to which one can really make serious progress in understanding what's possible here. That's the scale of an island. The question is scaling up. What can we learn about larger systems? So one of the most interesting stories, and one of the pieces that is frequently neglected in thinking about how hard or easy it will be, are stories like this. And I chose California because it's a very large economic system. And this shows electricity consumption per person in the United States and in California going back to the 1960s. Electricity use rising pretty similar in each. OPEC oil crisis happened. California set up an agency focused on making energy efficiency job one of all state agencies, from housing agencies to building to schools. And electricity use per person in California has remained flat since the early 1980s, whereas in the US overall, the rates slowed somewhat after the OPEC crisis, but it's still continuing to rise. And this difference, this kind of triangle or this wedge, is just transformational. if every state was as efficient as the top few, meaning New York, Wisconsin, California, Vermont, we would save more money at the federal level than the entire federal budget except for defense. So this is a huge amount of potential savings. And we're not even the best. Denmark, that does centralized heating, they take the waste heat from their power plants and they send it around for communities to heat them locally, do even better. So there's all manner of interesting opportunities to go well beyond this. So continuing with the California theme for a little bit, in 2006, California passed its greenhouse gas law that said instead of the business as usual path of emissions, this black is real data when the bill was passed, the gray was the forecast, California should bring its emissions back down in 2020 to what they were in 1990. That's the internationally agreed upon reference year. And California is ahead of schedule to get there by investing in a whole series of features, beginning with energy efficiency. And so it's interesting to take a look at kind of that strategy. And so the way California thinks about it is to say, if this is how much we would be emitting, this is in million tons of carbon dioxide, if this is our total emissions picture, if we did nothing between now and 2050, we have how polluting each fuel is, coal, gas, renewables, whatever, and then we have the amount of liquid fuel for our vehicles and amount of electricity. And the reason why I highlight this is because one thing that the science community, myself included, has clearly done a very bad job of is explaining how all the different measures fit together. And it's again why I started with that island example from French Polynesia. Every California legislator, whether they love or hate what's going on, knows this story and they know how individual actions fit into a bigger picture. So the description that every bill in the state ties to is some version of, first of all, we've got to be more efficient. We've got to simply use less liquid fuel, use less electricity. Job one. Next, electricity is much cleaner than fuels in essentially every case, so we need to push this box towards electricity. The mantra is now electrify everything. Every single chance, shift away from liquid fuels, whether they're fossil fuels or sustainable or questionably sustainable biofuels, simply push this way as much as possible. And then in every case next, pick the more and more efficient fuels in terms of greenhouse gases. So find ways so that in every case you have a chance to make a choice. Sorry, I went the wrong way there. Sorry about that. Find a way to crush this box down so that you substitute gas for coal. You substitute renewables for gas. You look at the life cycle and you just crush this box down. You're left with this small box remaining. And that's the objective of the overall policy. So a series of steps that bring you down here and then telling the story of why individual measures, a efficiency program for vehicles, a program for more efficient buildings, a policy to give what's called a, whoops, sorry about that, a fee-bait, so that if we have a vehicle sales program and there are vehicles that are more polluting and vehicles less polluting in the market, every time someone buys a more polluting vehicle, a fraction of that sales price goes to subsidize someone else that buys a more efficient vehicle. And so it's a transfer from the emissions wasteful to the emission misers. No federal money, no state money involved. It is simply a tax on choosing the more polluting, transferred to those who buy the cleaner types of vehicles. That process has been working wonderfully in a number of places. France, Denmark, California, Korea have all done versions of that. And so what we're seeing are things like the California story, where we've had biomass in the system, some geothermal, some small hydro, but in recent years, first wind and now solar have ramped up dramatically. It's not just because those cost increases, it's also because of this real big push. And we've had people like our prior governor who really pushed for this, and then our current governor, Brown, who we recycled, who has pushed even more for it. And so now California has the world's largest solar thermal plant, large baseload power. It's got storage, so you generate during the day, and then we can save it for up to 6 hours at night. the world's largest thin film solar, world's largest wind farm, over 490,000 homes in California have solar on the rooftops. And stunning everyone, myself included, vehicle manufacturing returned to California, something we never thought, in the form of Tesla and other. So it's an interesting change, and it really tied to not one policy, but a whole bunch of innovations. Some of the things coming, this is already, what I'll show you next is already the law in the Netherlands. It won't start in California till 2020. But that is that every new home built after 2020 must be energy neutral. So it's going to have to, through energy efficiency, solar on the roof and other things, be a home that's generating as much as it needs. Now, interestingly enough, housing developers must be doing such good business right now that they haven't noticed this little issue on the horizon. And I'm not sure quite why. I would have thought 2020 is pretty close. Maybe they'll get serious and scared in 2018 or something, we'll see. But the idea that we would be building homes only that are net producers onto the grid by 2020 is kind of exciting. And I can anticipate there'll be places in the state that are cloudy and whatever else that will have huge pushback. The state's already anticipated that because of this overall policy frame. And so what's now going on is an argument to say, okay, if you don't want to put the solar on your roof, that's fine. We will allow collections of homes to jointly invest in solar and put it on a big box store, a Walmart, a Whole Foods, or whatever else, and have their solar somewhere. It might not be on the roof, but it's somewhere else. But allowing these things and anticipating where companies may push back. And as I said, this is already the rule of law in the Netherlands today. It's progressive, but it's not outside the box. This one is. At the same time that California, they must have been feeling pretty uppity that day, when they passed the net zero home rule, they said that by 2030, all office buildings must be net zero. We don't know how to do that, right? Because each floor is like another whole house. And so the idea that we're going to meet that, I don't know how we're going to do it yet. But in a pretty brave move, the legislature passed both of these together. So overall, I've described a pretty complicated picture. There's all these different policies. There's a mandate for 1 million solar rooftops. By 2020, we're halfway there. There's a mandate for 1 million electric vehicles. We're about 150,000 so far. There's a mandate for 33% of our electricity from renewables by 2020. We're well ahead of schedule. There's a rule that we need to get 50% of our electricity from renewables in 2030. We think we're on the way to get there as well. So it's an overall collection of policies based partially on technology, but much more broadly on this kind of overall perspective. And so while that might not surprise you for California, it's certainly part of the discussion here. There are other places that are doing equally dramatic things. Kenya, a place you don't normally think of as a leader in this, has an equally dramatic plan. Kenya has a whole series of individual policies, same end goal, 80% reduction in emissions, but in the Kenyan case, their grid today is mainly hydropower, quite similar here, but they expect to have dramatically reduced hydropower available because of droughts exacerbated by climate change, population growth, etc. So Kenya has decided to switch over and to go from 60% hydro powered today to 30% or less hydro, but to grow geothermal so that it is 60%. So to swap basically hydro and geothermal. And the plan is, this is Nairobi, the capital, these cities along the Rift Valley are the center of growth for Kenya. There are new industries being built around places where geothermal is being installed. And Kenya is planning on tripling the size of its grid every 8 years. So just a huge expansion. Geothermal makes a great start, but they're also installing wind power on the hills around Nairobi. They're doing just a transformation around renewable energy. And it really speaks to leadership comes in many interesting different places. The place that we talk about all the time as suffering huge energy related disasters is, of course, China, which is now the largest consumer of energy on the planet, largest consumer of coal, has the worst air pollution. Actually, India may have just surpassed it on a health damage basis, but most of the reports in the press are about this. And even though this is a disaster, China and the United States transformed the dialogue around climate, and this is why I think this meeting that's going to go on in December is going to be a huge success. After 19 of these climate meetings around the planet, which really didn't produce any measurable goods, President Obama and Premier Xi had a handshake agreement in 2014, now signed as an agreement between the two countries, that they will together set climate targets, and they will have a two-party, so a G2, if you will, discussion around how to accelerate things. And the United States and China together are 40% of the world's energy consumption, about 42% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's kind of a remarkable agreement to put in place. And the degree to which we should really be excited about this discussion is that if we look at growth in energy demand around the planet, we look at the amount in OECD, industrialized nations, Middle East and Russia and India, all significant. But if I add China to that, this is the forecast growth in China. And so the fact that US and China kind of learned a basic lesson of political science, and that is that if you want to get something done, 189 voices in voting is a pretty inefficient way to get there. The two of them stepped out and set an agreement in place to move this process along. And just to give you a feeling for the scale, this is California's energy demand, which we've just been talking about. This is the demand across all of Western North America. And these are the ramp up in hydropower, wind, nuclear, and solar in China alone. This is planned growth in the coming years. So it's just a remarkable amount of growth. What I haven't plotted on here because it's too depressing is the current business as usual forecast for coal in China. But if China sticks to this agreement, which I would say they're better at sticking to agreements than we are, they are likely to now more than double the entire rest of the world's production of renewable energy in the coming years. So they're going to have to cut into their coal use, but this is just a remarkable run-up. And China is already the #1 producer of solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries for electric vehicles on the planet. So it's a really interesting time to get politics much more centrally connected to the story than we've seen before. So to highlight what I mentioned at the beginning needed to be an equal part of the story and what's going on large scale, I want to talk about the 1.5 billion people on the planet without energy. Not just because they deserve energy, we have lots of reasons why. Without access to energy, it's incredibly hard to support local industry, education, a variety of things, but also because we're seeing innovations that we should be listening to from communities that we normally kind of relegated to second-tier status. So what I didn't mention about Kenya before was that while they have this sort of very aggressive plan to grow the amount of energy from geothermal and wind and technologies on the grid, unlike us, where 99.9% of US citizens have electricity, in Kenya 20% are on the grid. So a wonderful plan to build out more generation without addressing that 80% off-grid is not going to get anywhere. This is the fastest growing source of new energy supply in Kenya, and it's a whole variety of off-grid products. Small lights, phone chargers, battery chargers, a whole variety of technologies being sold in relatively small amounts. So that these kind of devices that look at one level like glorified flashlights, they're kind of LED flashlights with little solar panels to charge them up, have become for much of the developing world the quickest way to get energy access. High efficient LED lights, high efficient batteries, same battery design as in your cell phone, and these incredibly cheap now solar panels providing a whole variety of basic services. And at the event at the White House yesterday, whole variety of companies from US, South Africa, Malaysia, were all there demonstrating all kinds of products, including incredibly low power DC full-size refrigerators. Full-size refrigerator for the US audience, but for Europeans and Africans and others, refrigerators that are much smaller in volume because we seem to think you should live in your refrigerator and have this massive device. But all of these things powered by incredibly small amounts of energy, coupling clean, distributed solar and energy with incredibly efficient appliances. And it's really changed in a dramatic way what we think about in terms of getting products out. What's interesting and what has really changed the story more than anything is these are the technology base to get these in place. But what really made this now the fastest growing new source of energy is actually not the energy system. It's information. So all of these people taking these devices home are not just going to stores and buying them. The reason why in Kenya, in Tanzania, in India, in South Africa, in Senegal, this is selling so rapidly is that those countries all have trusted systems to do mobile money. And it's actually mobile banking where you pay on your phone. You get scratch cards, you put money on, and you pay your bill. That has transformed this landscape. And it's a remarkable process. Some of the companies that I and others have worked with that are bringing these products to market in these developing countries are now doing the same thing in inner city communities in Los Angeles and Chicago. So pay as you go is the new way to think about what's going on. And we're seeing these popping up everywhere. In fact, last year, some of those companies I showed you crossed the point where they had sold more than 5 or 10 million of these devices. And more students that I talk to are getting into the energy field not by going through traditional routes, by starting companies selling all kinds of off-grid products. Televisions, refrigerators, all kinds of things, incredibly efficient. I'll just show a picture of, oh, I skipped it on there, okay. But showing all kinds of devices going into use. I'll skip those. We don't want, okay. But all of which are sales of small individual items, selling power at really small initial amounts, but scaling up to meet demands. So what I want to tie these together with in the end is something that 10 years ago we couldn't say. And now it is that saving energy, saving carbon are one and the same. And so as an example, let me just spend just a little bit of time showing a challenge that was started in California but has spread to a whole variety. Germany is doing a version. There's the cool climate challenge in the Philippines that kicked off last month. And this is a project where we built a very simple carbon and resource footprint tool to kind of assess what the cost of different investments were. And we ran this as a process where community groups come in and they organize to do assessments of what is the cost or the benefit of various switches. Here's a variety of pictures of these different competitions where community groups got together and assessed what was the carbon savings of biking to work, of doing a whole variety of different activities. And utilities in California and now Germany and Arizona and the Philippines have stepped up to enable a challenge where cities get together, share best practices, look at what the carbon footprint of each individual are, and to sort of assess them and look at them against each other. And as an example, what the California Air Resources Board does is provide the forum. Utilities generally provide checks. So the city of Riverside, California won our challenge last year. They received a check that covered the partial payment for a staff member. And so I want to show you kind of the tool that we used for that. So this, the first version was called Cool California. That's just a little biased and local. The new version is called Cool Climate. And there's versions of the calculator available for people, for cities, for school groups and things. And we did a kind of a standard thing. You figure out, how many miles do you drive? Are you a vegetarian? Are you a vegan? Do you walk to work? How many cars do you have? That kind of thing. And you run through the calculators, and the members of the communities use them. You figure out your transportation budget, et cetera, shopping. You put your utility bill in. The most interesting thing in the process was one that we put on as kind of an add-on at the end. The last page we call Take Action. And what it does is it says what's your carbon footprint, but then it lists the next 20 things that we've learned about and how much they would save you if you did them. So these are things the person has not yet done. For this particular individual, it's to buy a more efficient car. Tells you how much carbon you reduce, but also what would be your annual and your 10-year savings by getting a more efficient car. And so in this particular case, this person has committed to doing these 3 items on the list. The budget then tells them how much, and then when they actually do them and verify it, then their city gets the points in these kind of challenges. And this process, I never thought that this page would kind of be the thing that everyone loves to go look at. And so everyone, of course, wants to look at their own number. Then they asked for a way to examine it compared to their neighbors, because we may not be so good at doing it in absolute, but we know how to compete with the Joneses. And so the version that's available, Cool Climate, Berkeley EDU maps, I'll just show you some of the pictures of that to conclude. And so we've had up to 100,000 people using this site every day. And of course, what everyone does first is they go check on their own community and check on their neighbors. And so here is a version of that story. So this is carbon dioxide emissions from households. And to show it, I've just averaged it over each zip code. So some zip codes we don't have data for, but this gives you kind of a picture across the country over the zip codes. This is the overall greenhouse gas emission. You can go in and examine what the numbers are. So I'll show you the amount of natural gas use, largely in upper Midwest and some in the Pacific Northwest, but huge Northeast issue. Fuel oil consumption, we know there's a great deal of that used in the Northeast. And then at the housing level, let me just highlight the transportation CO2 budget. In the Bay Area and here, transportation is by far the biggest part of one's carbon budget, because electricity is quite clean. And so finding ways, incentives to cross over to get more electric vehicle use, that kind of picture I showed in California, shifting away from liquid vehicles towards electric vehicles is a critical part of the story. And so you can see this map of the areas where carbon from transportation is the big part of the story. For goods and services, and I'll just toggle back and forth, the maps kind of overlap. There are no surprises targeted around cities. But those of you with good eyes will notice that in a lot of these things, it looks kind of like a reverse pimple, right? There's a red blob and there's kind of a green core in a lot of these places, right? Let me just finish that up by the carbon of food. The places where we use excessive amounts of irrigation, fertilizer, California Central Valley, where we do the big crop circles, areas where our food budgets are ugly in terms of the carbon that goes into growing our food. And if I zero in on the cities to kind of illustrate that issue I mentioned with those little pimples, these 4 cities have won award after award for their green sustainable programs. Mayor Bloomberg racked up the awards when he was in office. San Francisco, Chicago, even Dallas have won tons of awards. And when you zoom in, what you see is that in the city center, in each case, it's very green. For the same level of income, an urban core, right? Although I still have trouble thinking about the Dallas urban core, but there really is one. But when you look at these cities, for the same income level, you simply have less square footage, less plug-in points, less hot tubs, et cetera, in urban cores. But then you see this huge red shadows around each of these cities. And no surprise, the cities that won these awards did so by winning an award for the urban center, but ignoring the suburbs. And of course, that's absolutely cheating, because the economic, often the political power in these cities is frequently tied here. But by only looking at the carbon footprint of the core, you're defining away the big part of the problem. And it's not just that the suburbanites commute more. It's also that shipping goods and services and all kinds of things to them all adds up to a budget. And I can think of several conversations where goods, we decided to order something online and we got the size we wanted, and then we weren't sure, so we ordered the one larger and smaller, and then we could return the items that were larger or smaller. And while that's fine, in terms of using Amazon, that's not great for the carbon footprint. Things are going back and forth. And so there's lots of issues of our affluent lifestyle that contributes to this not just driving and commuting. but it really highlights the opportunities to really change the story. It does also highlight the feature which I wanted to close on, that we have this absolute issue that while we know how to green our electricity mix, we're going to need much more mechanisms to find ways to either plan our communities better or to really push many of us into electrified transportation, even better, less car ownership, but finding ways to recognize all of the aspects of that footprint is going to be critical going forward. And so while I started off by kind of trying to highlight where we were in terms of this hopeful moment on climate, we're going to really have to find ways to pull the behavioral wedge and use different aspects to not just think about electricity, but to really integrate that thoughts with what we're going to do about transportation. And then the one that no one's working on that I highlighted here, and that is the carbon embedded in these goods and services is going to have to be brought under this kind of carbon management too. And this is a real challenge. It's an area where affluence and low carbon are really at conflict. But I want to just close with that. And to really thank you for listening through, which I hope was a useful tour of where we are and what are some of the tools and challenges moving forward. So thank you very much for the chance to speak. So let's fire away. And just say who you are too, so I can catch up.
I'm David Dellendorf. Could you break down between human residential and transportation consumption versus industrial generation of greenhouse?
So very roughly, I mean it varies by community, but very roughly at the national level, our carbon emissions are a third residential, a third commercial, and a third industrial. The more kind of progressive the community on average, the more you shift towards transportation. So in the Bay Area and here, transportation is roughly half of one's carbon budget. And that's generally because places that are able to push out into cleaner energy, to think about ways to get solar on rooftops and invest in wind farms and things, generally have the transportation piece lagging. And that's roughly the break. High-tech economies on renewable energy. And there are some skeptics who think that that won't work well. Energy use for our homes, relatively easy. Solar panels can go on the roof. But if you want to do big industrial processes, it's going to be hard. And that was definitely the sentiment kind of a decade or more ago. But as more and more economies in Germany, in Denmark, push out in Korea, we've seen there's not really a hurdle. The barrier that was missing was having storage get cheap the way I showed in that curve with solar. And storage is right now beginning to progress down that curve. Those who saw the announcement for Tesla, where they sold $35 million of this Powerwall, this kind of curvy, cool thing that you put on the wall in your garage and store power. And Tesla envisions themselves in 10 years as being a vehicle company, yes, but being a energy system company where solar on the roof, Tesla in the garage will be the overall picture. And just to kind of put it in perspective, an electric vehicle operated here is, and I'm sure you guys have done the calculation more, I did a very quick one, about 125 miles per gallon equivalent vehicle. And as you heard in the beginning, about a quarter of the cost of gasoline even today. And what's interesting is that the business opportunity for utilities here is massive. Each electric vehicle is equivalent to 2 to 3 homes. You turn on all the appliances in your home and you floor your car. And the energy for that car, 2 to 3 homes worth, right? So sort of the deal that we're saying, and I think we should say it more clearly to utilities, is we would like, as customers, valuing service and the environment, to say, we're willing to give you all our energy business. Up until now, we've been giving you a third of our energy business for our electricity, but we would like to shift our vehicles to you too, cutting the liquid fuel part of the story out. Now, those companies aren't going to go quietly, but the idea that we would shift much more, and so your home actually becomes kind of a smaller part of your energy bill to your utility, but it's running those electric vehicles that becomes the bigger part over time. And so that's a really interesting shift that I'm hoping is going to go on, and we're seeing the start, but we're early so far.
So along those lines, that cool California site that
Right.
rates your carbon footprint and tells you a whole list of things you could do,
Right.
savings and that. If you were to look at this area right here, our islands, what would be on your list of things that we could do that, effectively to reduce our carbon footprint?
Right. So for here, vehicles is critical. I mean, 49% of the carbon emissions per household here is cars. And so finding really innovative partnerships. Some people can buy electric vehicles right off, but others price challenge, although the price difference is pretty small now for the upfront cost, but it is still there. So finding ways to amortize out the savings, knowing you're going to be saving quite a bit each year on fuel, getting those cars in the garages is key. And so something we talked about in a little roundtable before, in California we have a program where the University of California system, with its almost 500,000 staff, faculty, and students, are working on a program where mortgages provided by the University of California, which it does to some staff and faculty, that if you retire an internal combustion vehicle, so you sell it, you no longer have the title for it, that they will allow you to write an EV purchase into the mortgage, because after all, an electric vehicle is like a toaster. It's a bigger one, but it's an appliance, right? So the argument is we're going to roll that in, and our houses are a little bit expensive, and I mean, not different than here, but you know, you have a $500,000 house, adding a $20,000 car to that mortgage is not changing things much, but it really changes the carbon story. So finding ways, for example, where the utility could get a good deal by buying or pre-ordering some electric vehicles and making those available to be sold, for example, doing an on-bill financing for that. There's a lot of mechanisms that could be used to find non-dealership ways to incentivize clean vehicles. Not just for individuals, for fleets, delivery companies, all variety of things to really push out. And so vehicles is going to be number one on that list. One that I am struggling with, because I saw the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, and when the son-in-law tells the mother, the Greek mother, that he's a vegetarian, she says, "You don't eat meat? You don't eat meat? That's okay, I'll make lamb." The real challenge is that making your diet more sustainable is another big deal. And so doing the carbon footprinting around food is a challenge. And meat, if not free range, is a real bugaboo here because of the inefficiency in the process. And that's one that I find challenging, but it is another place where there's big opportunities. But again, I invite anybody to use it. This cool California site I mentioned here, the cool climate site, sorry, is not California specific. All US zip codes are involved. And of course, the first thing to go in and look at your own versus your average of your neighbors is what everyone does to start off. So I think I saw a hand.
Yeah, Bill Watson here. So as we shift from the liquid fuels to electricity, and we increase our electrical consumption 10, 20, 30%, when do we break our fragile, aging electrical grid system in the country?
So I would say never, in the sense that what already is going on in progressive utilities and needs to go on in others is upgrading them to be smart systems. They already need to be for a variety of other reasons. We have a very aging system in the country overall, but the cost of sensors and of meters have come way, way down. So the ability to think about an electrical system which is very different today and in the future than what it was before. And the old system was a whole bunch of big baseload power plants, whether they're coal, nuclear, oil, gas, hydro, would just simply run, is already gone. And as soon as that's gone, the idea that the utility would be much more a manager of a whole bunch of different sources of supply, including energy and storage, is now vastly easier than it would have been without this kind of revolution in information technology. What it does mean, though, is that one's home, business, and the grid operators all have to be really smart. I mean, by the devices, by the algorithms. But that 20 or 30% increase, and probably more if you really electrify all, looks like it will be a challenge for utilities that don't want to progress. But for those that want to take advantage of what's out there, it will add cost, but not make things impossible. And that cost should justifiably be passed on. But you're saving so much on liquid fuels. When we do assessments state by state across the West, we actually find that the increase in your overall energy bill will actually be negative. So compared to the bill of buying liquid fuels for your vehicles and buying electricity, we find on average you will save. And the Obama Clean Power Plan for the country came up with the same conclusion. They found $60 to $70 reduction in annual bill in 2025 by going this green route. So very different than we thought 10 years ago. All the way in the back.
Thank you for that talk. That's great. I was really interested in the information you presented about Kenya. And I have to say I have two concerns when I hear about that. One is, and I'm just curious of how Kenya is going to pay for all of that new infrastructure. And the second thing is, I don't know about Kenya specifically, but a lot of poor countries have a lot of political corruption, and you worry about big projects like this actually coming to fruition.
Right. So there's no question, there are some countries that are highly corrupt and it's a huge challenge. Some things that are called corruption in Kenya, we call best practice in the United States. And there's a lot of things we've rolled into our system that we've kind of made look regularized, whereas we call them out there. There's no question, there are some countries, and Kenya does have a fairly poor corruption record. So I don't want to minimize how bad it is, but a lot of things are actually not specific to developing countries. Kenya will likely largely pay for this in kind of the way infrastructure has been paid for in the last decade or so, and that's a mixture of international loans and some domestic financing. Right now, Kenya is in a very powerful position. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda are currently the countries that have the fastest growing economy in the world, over 7% a year, where China has slowed down a little bit below that. So those three are in a very good spot to start paying for it. But the real likely route for paying for it is going to be this very active economy and the big gains they're seeing by connecting more of the population in. So nothing simple about doing this process in East Africa, but economic growth there is kind of off the charts. IBM recently assessed its 6 international laboratories, and the laboratory in Kenya came out as the most productive per dollar spent of all of their laboratories, largely because the markets for new IT systems, this kind of mobile banking I mentioned, was really dramatic. And so it's an interesting example. There is a downside, though. Kenya has also discovered oil, gas, and uranium. And so it is not going to be simple to stay on this path because there's big bucks in those areas, too. So I would say watch this space. But it's a pretty interesting opportunity, and they are so far holding pretty well to this plan. So great question. Yeah.
Yes, you had talked about a water conversion electrical system that was used on this island.
Right.
We who potentially are facing serious drought.
Yeah.
And have a lake for our water. Is it possible for us to look at that kind of system to generate both water and power for our island as hydropower decreases in the northwest?
Yeah. So great question. The system I mentioned here, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble getting the picture back up. I think it's somewhere here. This one. This here, this is, this couldn't be done in a lake because this is based on the tidal energy. So it's the density difference of fresh water in the tank to salt water outside, moving back and forth in the current. The way they produce fresh water is that it turns out, it's a little more technical, the topping cycle, the regular part, this pressurized tube generates enough energy. They use that to generate power. But there's an outflow cycle. It's called a bottoming cycle. And that's actually got enough pressure to run a reverse osmosis system. So they produce fresh water right at the head here, and then it just gets pumped on land. So you couldn't use this in lakes. But what's that?
I don't think he was talking about lakes. I think he was talking about water all around
Yeah, so you absolutely could. So if you did this in the, so I misinterpreted. So as an ocean system, absolutely. And you guys have just incredible tidal energy here. So absolutely, this is a great way. And what's really neat about this system here is that I'm just not.
You have to hold it for about 2 seconds.
Oh, okay. There we go. I think. Yep. But the tidal energy is highly reliable. And so it's very easy to predict. And so one feature is that it would give you a very reliable so-called base load amount of renewable energy. So it's a natural fit in the systems here. Right.
So I find the issue of meat consumption is really ignored by environmentalists. And
Sorry about that. Thanks.
I recently watched the documentary Cowspiracy, which is on Netflix.
Yep.
And they claim that meat consumption is responsible for more global warming than the entire transportation sector. And I'm curious how you respond to that.
Yeah.
specifically.
So it's not meat per se. It is industrial factory style operations. And so the issue of free range animals of any type, I mean, it's a personal choice to be vegetarian on that basis. But in terms of the carbon issues, it's the high amount of food that is grown with irrigation and with pesticides, and the inefficiency of making that into meat is the real critical issue. So if one can find ways to do more of the free range, low impact, it makes a big difference. And so that number, I mean, it's come up a lot. Whether the meat industry is in fact worse than all of transportation, my numbers say no, but it's not that different. And so I think that the sentiment is exactly right. And so that's why I showed it here. I mean, trying to get this as part of the equation is a tough story. As again, that shift is going to be rough, because even if kind of affluent communities are shifting down to lower amounts of meat, which is generally the trend, it's exactly the opposite trend in places where the economies are booming, that we're seeing meat consumption rise dramatically. And so, huge challenge. That's why I wanted to kind of put it on par here. There's a movie that we just helped to produce called Time to Choose, that was made by Charles Ferguson, who won an Academy Award for making Inside Job about the financial crisis. And so Charles's movie, for which I'm an associate producer, is coming out, we hope, by the Paris meeting, but if not, soon thereafter. And it tries to kind of tell the energy story I told, but also spend kind of a pretty sizable amount on land use and also food. So thanks for kind of re-raising it. But no easy answers on this one.
You talked about dams.
Thanks so much.
And how we got relatively clean energy here, but there's a lot of methane being produced by the stored water.
Yeah.
It's coming more to light, it being much more
Yeah.
non-green.
So this is a great, and I did totally skipped over this. And so dams in temperate areas, whatever their impact on fish and other things are, is one thing. But much of the dam technology that we installed in places here where there's generally high head height, so you get a lot of power out of the dam per area, that's not true in the tropics. And so when you look at the methane emissions for dams, there was a big study done in India. There was a study done for what would happen if the world's largest proposed dam is built, which is not the Three Gorges Dam in China. It's the Grand Inger Dam that would be built on the Congo River. Very low head height. So you need a large flooded area with lots of vegetation. There are a number of dams around the world where the methane emissions per amount of energy are higher than simply burning natural gas. And so a real worry. Let me just give one other aspect, which is not about dams, but kind of illustrates what you're really mentioning, which is doing this full life cycle analysis. Lots of the push towards lower carbon energy around the planet recently has actually not been from renewables, but from the shift from coal to gas. And that's been a great thing because it's allowed us to really ramp down what was the most polluting per unit energy source, which is coal. However, we've been assessing the leakage around the country and around the world from conventional gas and from fracked gas systems, many of which are installed very rapidly because this boom, this push to get them in place. And when you look at the leakage rates of those systems, they can be several percent, 2 or 3% of the total amount of gas delivered is leaked. And because leaked gas is methane, a very potent greenhouse gas, turns out that if that leakage rate is about 2.5 or 3%, then a coal plant is cleaner than a gas plant. And this is something people are not going to talk about, because this is not the energy delivered in gas that we burn. This is the leaked gas. So for example, in California, which has a very stringent carbon cap for 2030, what we find is that we would be devoting roughly half of our total carbon budget to natural gas we burn and natural gas that we leak. And that's impossible, because there's no way we could make the overall system work if we take the numbers seriously. The good side is that we probably could beat that down a lot, but it does speak to the need to do what you described, which is do this careful life cycle analysis. And that is at an early stage. And so I worry about large dams, I worry about gas plants for very similar reasons. So great point.
Bruce Gregory. My question relates to the impending move towards the EV in the private sector, but I'm really curious as to what your thoughts are on the need for better battery technologies, push that envelope forward, and see it enter into the actual wholesale and the massive amounts of transportation. I mean, anybody who's been on the freeway lately noticed the number of large diesel trucks. I mean, where are we going to get the power of that transportation?
Yeah.
Battery technology.
Right. So I showed that curve, which I didn't title it by what it was. These, I forgot where I put it. Those curves showing the price declines. Here it is. This is the one for solar. It's called the learning curve, and they're incredibly consistent. We've been investing, as you can see, in solar since the 70s, and this prices have come down just phenomenally. So that right now you can do solar projects for about 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour in some areas. So it is incredibly cheap. Batteries got a very, very late start. Only in about 2007-8 did we start to really invest hard into batteries. And batteries are right now exactly on the same curve, showing that real drop in price. So for smaller vehicles, the battery learning curve, if we continue, looks like it will continue, and very attractive. But you also mentioned larger vehicles, trucks and things that, for example, have to not only power the vehicle, but also keep, for example, a load cold in the back of the 18-wheeler. For that, potentially batteries, but also hydrogen, fuel cells, a variety of other technologies exist. And what's interesting, and this is going to sound like, but it's not intended to be a knock on nuclear, these are a series of learning curves. I showed you the one for solar, for wind technology, for biofuels, for NOx controls on power on small turbines, all of which show that drop in price. This is the learning, or I guess I should say forgetting, curve for nuclear. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why we changed the rules on nuclear plants after 3 Mile Island, but any technology that's been being installed commercially now for almost 50 years, where the cost is rising, is a worry. And the reason why this is going on is because while all of these things are technologies we can mass produce and kind of learn, first the Japanese, lean manufacturing where things just arrive when you need them, etc. Nuclear plants are an example of a class of things where that learning is much less. A nuclear plant is as much about the reactor core as it is about the geography where the plant is, the design issues, and we see the same thing for other big things. Bridges, which are almost all unique. Battleships, things that you don't build a lot of. Another technology which worries me for the same reason is so-called carbon capture and storage. Burning carbon in a power plant is one thing. Separating it is a little bit of a challenge. But then the whole process of burying that carbon, which has been proposed, and there are some plants around, depends on the underground geology. And so I just highlight this again, not because this is a specific nuclear attack, it's not, but because there are types of things for which our systems are helping us to learn more about. And there are others which are unique enough individually that we're not seeing that kind of effect. And so there's some really interesting things we need to get our heads much more around and figure out as we go. Yes?
It appears that the growth and certainly the persistence of a lot of these really horribly inefficient energy systems have arisen because of a public policy that has allowed the externalization of many of the costs
Yeah.
associated with that. And I think we can look to some other industries like solid waste and packaging that Germany has done to really kind of fully capture that full life cycle
Right.
analysis, and then really made the manufacturers responsible for that.
Right.
And you see this huge shift in the economy there.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering from a global perspective, is there anything analogous to that in the energy sector?
Right.
And we have any hope that actually the energy sector would actually pay for the full cost of the production?
Right, so great question. Just a kind of example to illustrate it. Many of you bought laptops and didn't realize that there was, in the states that do it, I can't remember if Washington does, Oregon, California, Vermont all do, there's a take-back fee baked into the cost. It's about $28 per laptop. And it's the commitment by the companies not to recycle physically the platinum, the cadmium, the things in your machine, but to recycle the amount equivalent to their annual sales. And this began, as you mentioned, in Germany, where first BMW, then others committed to say, we commit to taking back an equal amount of material that are go into our vehicles. So we have interesting examples. I don't think any of us didn't buy a laptop because of that fee, right? So I think that is a workable piece. And the argument about getting there in the energy sector would be that there's a huge amount of externalities. The cost to low-income communities, the pollution damage that we're not capturing. And so pricing emissions, a tax on carbon, a cap and trade system is the most standardly referred to version of that. The track record of those prices has not been great, but what's interesting is that we're not even capturing many of the benefits. So for example, in California right now, we have a carbon price, it's about $11 a ton. The carbon price at one time in Europe was $35 a ton. It's now crashed to about $5 because to get everyone to buy into it, they gave away a huge amount of permits. It has been very ineffective. The New England version has, the Reggie version, Mid-Atlantic states, has not been great. California's have been pretty steady. China has done a 2-year study. Some people think it's sufficient study, some people not. But they are launching in 2016 a national carbon cap and trade system. And so that gives me a lot of hope. That's actually a fair number of experiments doing so. California's price on carbon, $11 a ton. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has done a project over the last 5 years to estimate what's the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is $35 a ton. That's there, and you know, even in California, we're way below it in Europe, so we have not even brought it up to what we think are the damages. And a classic example is that programs to bring electric vehicles into big cities not only get those, replace petroleum, but they dramatically reduce NOx and other pollution in cities. So there's a huge environmental justice benefit by getting electrified vehicles into big cities, predominantly lower income people living in communities where they get affected. And so there's some really important benefits to getting that process in place. Right now, the assessment is that at the US federal level, there's no appetite to put this on. There's a lot of discussion, but not a lot of action on it. And so even the US government is saying, well, we'll wait for these regional markets. California and Quebec have a joint carbon market. And maybe with the new change of government in Canada, this will expand out. We'll see what happens between Quebec and Alberta. But getting this kind of calculus into place would I think have a big effect. But it's been a real challenge. And so I think there's no easy answer to kind of this point, but it's a great question. So.
Okay, so one question. Did you guys have a bar at some point?
Did I what? Yes. Oh, sorry. Apologies for...
I guess I'm surprised at the level of acceptance, or at least the way you presented it in government, about climate change, because I feel like that's not necessarily how it's portrayed in the media. And so I think having, seeing what's going on in California, it's obvious to me that having laws in place with these goals in mind, if everyone's abiding by those, and there's sort of this like, oh, well, this is of course what we have to do because everyone else is doing it too, and it changes the culture of it. So I think having politicians on board becomes really important. And so I'm curious, this level of acceptance right now, is it just that certain politicians are providing lip service to their constituents and really buy in, or do you think that what's going on right now at the national level is strictly because of the administration that's in there, and should we be, really worried about what's going to happen in the next coming years?
Well, I would say we should be really worried what's happening right now. Because while the current administration has bought in very strongly, has pushed a whole set of very strong measures, they're not bringing anything to the Congress because they know nothing will get through. So everything I talked about is executive, not legislative, right? Huge problem. California's climate law, which I described in very positive terms, has won on electricity and on efficiency. But in the vote that happened just a few weeks ago, the goal to reduce by 50% petroleum lost. And I'm not surprised it lost. So the bill was called SB, Senate Bill 350, 350s. First 50 is 50% clean electricity by 2030. That made it through. 50% more efficient buildings in 2030 than today. That made it through. And then the last one was kind of just a huge shot into the dark. That was a 50% reduction in petroleum use. And none of the bills I've talked about so far actually did that kind of huge cut. And so I'm not surprised that didn't get through. I think the mood in California is it will get through in the next cycle. But at the federal level, we're not there at all. I mean, there's been no Waxman Markey, no climate bills come back up. There is no path that the administration sees to have this dialogue in the House and the Senate right now around these issues. And so while they think that the Clean Power Plan, which is a set of state-by-state very aggressive programs put in by the federal government, will survive appeal, it's not one that has gone to the House and Senate. They have a different route. It turns out that the Supreme Court was willing to classify carbon dioxide as a pollutant, and as a result, EPA gets to regulate pollutants. So it seems on very stable ground, but I would be worried today. And what happens in the next administration, I'm certainly scared and stunned that certain people are still viable candidates, but might just me be the Oakland, California bubble. But I think one should be very worried about where we're going. But I mean, the sense that I tried to convey, I think you picked up, and that is that this perception of, oh, I know where we're going, ends up being really critical. Because you talk to a politician who both approves and disapproves of this, and they know where we're going. And so each individual bill, whether it's on transportation or electricity or something else, they see where it fits in, and it makes it much easier to talk about why we're doing given things. In the past, where each bill was kind of something on an island, it was much harder to tell that story. And I think that's made legislation, places like here, in Korea, and Japan, Denmark, much less fragile than they were before. But I would be very worried today. 40% of US voters still deny some aspect of the story, whether they deny climate change, or whether they deny that we're responsible, or as the Senate Republicans just said, even if we are responsible, we're not acting until China acts. Well, I would argue China just acted, but they're still the biggest polluter. So I don't think there's any easy way around, but I do think that there's real strength in having an integrated picture on this. So, I mean,
the related question would be whether business sees this as an opportunity, increasingly an opportunity, and because they're the ones who control Congress.
Right.
And if they really see that
Right.
this is a bandwagon they want to get on.
So your point goes back to your question, I would say.
Yes.
And a version of it is, when you ask the Fortune 500 companies, there was just a panel, if you go to the White House website and you look at Act on Climate, which is the national program, more than 200 of the Fortune 500 companies all said they signed up and they all committed to various acts. Whether that's lip service and they don't do it because we're getting near an election cycle, we'll see. But we've never had 200 of the top 500 before make commitments. And when you go on the Act on Climate page, they're pretty dramatic. I mean, they're not small-scale actions. The US Overseas Investment Bank committed to making climate the #1 investment area. PepsiCo committed to 1 billion kilowatt hours of clean energy. They're very significant targets. The wind farm I showed in Kenya, Google bought it last week. And so it's kind of funny. It's a site I go to a lot. It's in far northern Kenya. It's quite a dangerous area in terms of Somali raiders and things if you go to the far north part of the story. European governments graded the roads, provided security, hardened the transmission lines, did all this stuff, and then Google bought it up. Very clever. All the infrastructure's there, and now they've announced they're going to double it in size. So there'll be a private investment that will bring it up. So whether those kinds of investments continue, I mean, we'll see. But it's a pretty interesting suite of things that are at least committed to on paper. So let me jump aside.
Dan, could you talk a little bit about what your role is leading up to the Paris climate talks and then perhaps after the Paris climate talks?
I'm just a state employee. I just go where I'm told. So, I mean, it's a nice position. You know, I get to sort of play a role for California, and California's big problem is not the individual pieces, it's that we need a very aggressive foreign policy. And so California's foreign policy right now involves something called the Under 2 MOU, the Under 2 Degree Memorandum of Understanding. And as of last count, 40 other subnationals around the world, 10 Mexican states, 4 German states, Vermont, I don't remember if Washington signed, I think Washington might have, but I don't remember, have signed on to harmonizing their plans, like I showed with California, with this path under 2 degrees. So I'll be at a whole bunch of events talking about that. I also work a lot on these off-grid issues, and so I'll be chairing something for Tim Worth called the Global Alliance on Clean Cook Stoves. That will also be about the connection between women's health, cooking fuels, and also now bringing lighting into that story as you saw the technology. So I'll get to do those things. And I will certainly find a few Parisian restaurants to spend some time into. So, but it'll be fun. Yeah.
I'm Caroline Irwan. I'm a marine naturalist educator, and so I spend a lot of time with people from all over the world in different places and focusing on ecosystem
okay.
and sea life. But climate change questions
Yeah.
come up more quickly. What's the one take-home message that I can share?
Well, so when the question's too good, then you find a way to avoid it, right? So, so I would say the big thing I haven't talked about at all tonight ties into this, and that is whether we do all these things or not, we have a pretty good picture for what to do on this mitigation side. We know the technologies and the policies to cut our emissions, but we're already committed to a lot of climate change. We're going to have at least a foot of sea level rise over the next 40 years, maybe quite a bit more. And adaptation is a real problem. We do not understand. It's hard to think about what we're going to be adapting to, let alone plan on it. And so understanding what parts of our infrastructure, I mean the cities that will be partially underwater, whether the physical part you see or the infrastructure, we don't know how to think about investments in these areas. A orca story that really sort of scared me was that it turns out orcas are so far a massive beneficiary of climate change. And in the Arctic, what's going on is that as ice recedes, orcas can get into areas they couldn't before. And so belugas and narwhals and former generally non-prey species, sometimes prey, but generally not, that used ice to hide themselves from marine predators, like orcas, are now much more exposed. And so, you know, you get these curious things. I mean, orcas are great. We love them. They're beautiful. We tried to see some this morning. Didn't work out. But there are surprising winners and losers. And those things are going to require us to think differently about fisheries issues, about current, about impacts on crops. Those things, those adaptations, we're in the dark ages on. We don't know how to assess the risks. Humans are really bad at probabilities. If I tell us in the room the chance of next year being cold or hot because of climate change is higher or lower, we're terrible at understanding probabilities and what the impacts would be. We're quite good if you say, you know, I got a climate score on the calculator of 7 and you got a 7.1. What can I do to beat you? Right? We know how to up the ante and beat our neighbor. But in terms of these broader things, the impacts on ecosystems are much more this probabilistic stuff. Our brains are so far not wired to understand those kind of systemic impacts. So I think the first thing is to understand how these impacts unfold and just start thinking about what kind of insurance are we willing to start purchasing for things that are going to change. Food is going to dramatically change. Where it's grown, productivity levels, impacts of extreme events, we're not prepared. So I avoided your question because I didn't know an answer, but it's a great one. So, yeah.
So this is just a small detail, not about adaptation or survival, but you mentioned twice, I've seen it before, China is the biggest producer of global warming. Since when? And also, who is the biggest producer per capita? I mean, I don't know if it's
Right.
necessarily the US, but are we
Right,
talking
okay.
per capita or per
Right,
year
so,
or what?
right, so great question. So China eclipsed us in total greenhouse gas emissions. The numbers are hard because the Chinese numbers aren't really great, but sometime in 2011 or 12, China passed over us. However, while China may have passed us because they produce more emissions, where are most of those goods used, right? So here, right? So, you know, my brother and I play a game. We go into stores and flip over things and where are they made. I think the jacket I'm wearing today, made in Indonesia, where my brother lives. And so this issue of where it's produced versus where it's used, it's made the national boundary story a little bit irrelevant. So when I show those plots of the zip codes, lots of those goods were made in Malaysia, Indonesia, China. And so figuring out who should get the blame or how do you ascribe how you do it, that's a much harder question. And that's where the question over here about the carbon price came in. As a good example, BMW now makes BMWs in Bavaria and in China, same model car. At California's current $11 a ton price, the same 325i, if you import it from Austria, which is 90% hydro, versus China, which is 85% coal, at $11 a ton, that BMW should cost $900 more if you buy the Chinese one. So that's great. We sign a carbon price. That sounds great. You know, we'll discriminate on our products. But of course, it turns out that technically that's illegal by World Trade Standards. So finding ways to do what's called border adjustments to kind of reflect not just where they're made, but where they're consumed, we're in bad shape on. You had a second part of the question that I forgot to.
Per capita.
Okay. So right now, Abu Dhabi is #1 per capita, but there's not a lot of capitas. In terms of bigger nations, Canada is ahead of the United States in emissions per person, and then the US comes as #3. There might be one other small, what's that? No, they're actually a little bit lower, it turns out. But again, but they're a little bit lower on the overall. So, good question. Should we do?
So I wanted to come back to what you were just saying about probabilities, and I'd just like to suggest that, I mean, you actually said it when you talked about insurance. I think that people are they understand that quite well when they purchase insurance, that they're talking about probabilities of something happening and balancing risk. And so in that sense, I think people are prepared for that.
I would love to. So there's a project that I'm a huge fan of that Hank Paulson and a California investor, Tom Steyer, funding. It's called Risky Business. And it's an effort to look at the economic impacts of a whole variety of risky issues, climate change being one, wars being another. But it is an example of trying to do this. But we haven't been very good consumers of data, which is probabilistic, I mean, for a variety of reasons. And so if we can get better at it, that would help. So great point. Let me do one more and then
Just to follow up on that.
Sure.
You've got big insurance underwriters like Swiss Re and a lot of it than some of the others.
Yeah, so I guess to turn, I mean, to sort of restate, but maybe to make it into a question, there are companies like Swiss Reinsurance. I mean, the reinsurance industry was an early leader on getting climate change information into their portfolio. And the argument is kind of very straightforward, and that is that reinsurance companies take on things that often have a low probability of a high consequence event. And so they're good at things. They've developed tools to look at events also over a longer time window than many of us are used to. The standard problem for many clean energy investments, whether it's buying that electric vehicle that has a higher upfront cost but will save you $500 a year, is that we consistently see that things that don't pay people back in only a few months, it's a real hard sell, no matter what it is, whether it's energy or healthcare or eating better or whatever else. We often find that that's a real tough story. So we're not good at it, but there are some companies that are. And interestingly enough, one of the real challenges is trying to communicate both to lay people and also to experts what it would mean if the so-called the tail of the distribution is fatter. What if the probability of a Sandy goes up by a very little bit? How do you price in the billions of dollars that you would pay if it happens versus doing nothing and thinking that, well, if it happened now, maybe it won't happen for 10 years. I won't be in office anymore. I don't worry about it. That has been a huge challenge. Couple governments, the Dutch government has gotten very, very good at this because they think a lot about long-term flood management for obvious reasons and have started to invest differently as a result. But I would say there are very few examples like Swiss Re and Munich Re that are really kind of making this central. Okay.
So, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Feel free.
This is global warming. First of all, I'm not a global warmer denier. Secondly, I don't deny that we're causing the problem. But I wonder if you could address a little bit about the geoengineering programs, schemes, and projects that are going on. Ken Caldara, I think a colleague of yours is involved in those. Some of them are quite dangerous, and I know you had won the Global Peace Prize, part of it, but some of these programs are not peaceful. You know, they're putting particulates in the air.
Right.
They could be responsible for forest fires, and it's very dangerous. So I wonder if you could address that.
So I totally agree, and I'm very worried about this for a variety of reasons. One is that the idea that we could, do a geoengineered solution, spray particles in the air so we reflect more stuff back into space. There was even a proposal made by another colleague, I won't mention, David Keith, to wrap glaciers in blankets essentially to reflect more. So the challenge with these things isn't that we could maybe technically do them. It's that, one, we don't know enough about the details of many of these processes, and these things have become remarkably cheap and easy. The current estimate for the price tag for what it would take to geoengineer, if everything works right, the climate system, by spraying sulfate, basically by spraying seawater into the atmosphere to reflect back more sunlight and make sure you get just the right amount. You don't want to do too much, not too little. It's a little problem. It's a few $1 billion. So it doesn't mean just a country. It means an individual could do this. And the worry is that the temptation, maybe even motivated by the right kind of overall thought, but a total misunderstanding of ecological systems is very possible now. And so I'm very worried about this, partially because it's so seductive. Why spend trillions of dollars, work on all this behavior change, all this hear this guy from Berkeley speak for 2 hours, when we could just put up a satellite, spray the stuff, and be done with it, right? Yeah, we have to tailor the amount we spray each year, and if we spray too little or too much, we have another ice age, we'll take that risk. But it's incredibly seductive technically. And there's probably the most famous paper ever published in Science, the top US journal, was by an ecologist named Garrett Hardin. And he wrote, "Beware of the technical fix to a social problem." And you never fix a social problem, kind of a mixture of our consumption and how we're managing the planet, by thinking there is a cute technical way out. But it's incredibly seductive. It always gets funding at the federal level because, if you kind of solve it, well, we're all done. We can move on to something else. So I'm tremendously worried, and it's very easy to do. So.
It does nothing about ocean acidification.
Right. Well, so I didn't say there weren't other problems, right? I am a huge enemy, of doing it, but the potential for it to happen, it is kind of sitting right there, right? Yeah.
Mike Cohen, and one of the challenges I see in what you're talking about is people are saving money by doing all this, and most of the motivation seems to be in that direction. But as soon as they have the money, the whole rest of the the world is really trying to profit off of that and sell them other things, which are much more impact on the totality. So we're just doing the right thing in the energy field. But we're not addressing what you say is we're not hardwired to do other things, and I think that's incorrect. We are hardwired to know the planet as a living organism, and we are hardwired to know that it's insane to destroy your own life system, and we are hardwired to understand that if we protected the planet under the Endangered Species Act, all the stuff would go into some kind of a formula which would balance it all out, but we're not anywhere near that. What worries me is that when you come up with the solutions that you come up with here, that the rest of it is being omitted, and so really it's part of the problem if you don't address the wholeness of it. What's happening, as you've described it, to the North Pole and the seas there, is happening to the same number of species have disappeared in the same 50 years that the solar ice has disappeared. That mental health, the illness has increased the same amount as that. There's a whole thing going on globally, and there's a social technology that addresses that is completely out of sight.
So, I mean, I definitely hope this is true in the sense that we're kind of hardwired to recognize these things. I mean, I think that one brilliant thing, whether one is Catholic or not, that the Pope in the encyclical on climate really highlighted, how damaging the planet is damaging ourselves. It's not, I mean, in his Catholic language, you're not respecting God if you destroy nature because it affects us. I actually thought it was one of the most eloquent versions of bringing the ethics of our overall, his word was, we're making the world into a big pile of filth, right? That was the actual language. It was a great sort of statement, and if something is missing from this dialogue, I would say it is, I mean, one of the things, is certainly getting this kind of the ethics of what we're doing, how it impacts ourselves, getting us to be more reflexive on our impacts. That would be a great step forward if we can get there. But we're slow. I mean, we have made technology as opposed to the kind of social story at the beginning of our approach.
I'd just like to add that it's not an ethics problem or a moral problem. It's actually a psychological problem that we're addicted to being satisfied by these technologies and the immediate benefits of them. And unless you address this whole problem as an addiction or as an attachment, which is beyond you're usually working with it, which is not being done, it's just going to continue. You talk to any addict and give them all this information, they're not going to change their behavior until they get to what satisfaction they can get from something that's alternative.
So I'm not sure how to address that. I mean, I like the idea that we could, make this more part of our understanding of how what we're doing is to damage. And I want to thank you. I see people, we've definitely gone a long time. And so I want to thank everyone for staying late. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Oh,
Good news is we're wired for fear.
That's probably true. So.